Something has been shifting for women exactly your age this year, and I think, quietly, you've already felt it. Not the loud kind of shift, not a headline, not an event you could point to on a calendar. Something smaller than that, and stranger. A song on the radio that undoes you in a way it never used to. A glance held a half second too long with someone at the pharmacy counter. A dream you woke up from feeling oddly lighter, though you couldn't say why. If any of that sounds familiar, I need you to sit with me for a moment tonight, because I don't think it's nothing. I think it might be the very beginning of something you'd quietly decided was finished. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Get your tea or your coffee, whatever's keeping your hands warm tonight. Because what I want to talk about is love. Not the love you've already lived, the one you built a whole life around, but the possibility of a new one, arriving now, in the second half of your life, when you least expected to go looking for it again. I know how that sentence lands for some of you. I know there's a part of you that just flinched a little, maybe even rolled your eyes, maybe felt something closer to grief than hope. You've made peace, or told yourself you have, with the idea that this particular door closed a while back, and closed for good. Maybe you buried a husband. Maybe a marriage ended in a different, quieter kind of loss. Maybe you simply got busy raising children, burying parents, building a career, holding a family together, and by the time you looked up, love had become something that happened to other people, in other decades, in other lives that weren't yours anymore. None of that means what you think it means. And that's really what tonight is about. I want to describe a few things to you, and I suspect you'll recognize more than one of them. You've caught yourself, in the last little while, lingering a beat longer than necessary over a photograph of yourself from 30 years ago, not with sadness exactly, but with a strange, unfamiliar curiosity, as if some part of you were quietly asking that woman what she still wants. You've stood in front of your own closet and pulled out something you haven't worn in years, something with a little color in it, a little shape, and put it on just to see, then stood there in the mirror a moment too long. You've noticed, with something like surprise, that you're humming again in the kitchen, in the car, a habit you'd lost somewhere in the hardest years and hadn't realized was gone until it came quietly back. You felt a flicker of something when a stranger held a door or asked how your day was going and actually waited to hear the answer. And then you talked yourself out of the flicker so fast you barely let yourself notice it happened. You've wondered, in the exact privacy of your own mind, whether it's foolish, whether a woman your age, with your history, your losses, your responsibilities, has any business wanting to be looked at that way again. None of this is foolish. None of it is too late. And none of it, whatever anyone in your life might imply, is something you should be quietly ashamed of feeling. And maybe there's one more thing, smaller still, that you haven't told anyone. A name from years ago has drifted back into your mind more than once lately, unbidden, for no reason you can point to. Or you've caught yourself, mid-conversation with an old friend, saying something like, "I don't know, maybe I'm not done yet," about a part of your life you'd quietly filed away as closed. You said it almost as a joke. It wasn't a joke. You might be telling yourself right now that noticing all of this doesn't actually mean anything, that it's just a passing mood, a strange week, a song that happened to catch you at a soft moment. I understand why you'd want to believe that. It's safer than the alternative. But I don't think it's true, and I think some part of you doesn't fully believe it either, or you wouldn't still be sitting here with me. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind, because I think you already sense there's more underneath this than a passing mood. There's a reason this particular ache has a different shape than the grief you carried at 30, or the loneliness you may have carried at 50. This one has a kind of forward motion in it, even when it frightens you. And before I tell you exactly what that forward motion means, and why Carl Jung, yes, the psychologist, stay with me, believed something remarkable happens to a woman's capacity for love in the second half of her life, there's a harder, more honest piece we need to walk through first, because the hope only holds if we build it on something true. So let's start there, honestly, the way we always do by this fire. The truth is that most women your age who feel this quiet stirring toward love don't talk about it. Not to their sisters, not to their oldest friends, sometimes not even to themselves, in any language more direct than a vague, guilty restlessness they can't quite name. There's a real fear underneath the silence, and I don't want to skip past it the way so many conversations do, rushing straight to the encouraging part before you've been allowed to feel the weight of what's actually hard here. Part of the fear is simple and completely reasonable. You have been hurt before, maybe by loss, maybe by betrayal, maybe by a slow erosion of a marriage that took the best years of your patience and gave back less and less as the decades went on. Whatever the shape of it, your heart has scar tissue, and scar tissue is, by its nature, cautious. It doesn't open easily just because a season changes. It remembers. And so even as some part of you leans toward the idea of being loved again, another part stands guard at the door, arms crossed, absolutely certain that opening it again means risking the same pain twice. There's a second fear underneath that one, quieter, and I think even more common, and it has almost nothing to do with the men or the possibility of romance at all. It has to do with permission. Somewhere along the way, so many of us absorbed the idea that wanting to be loved, wanting to be desired, wanting a hand to hold again after 60 is somehow undignified, frivolous, a little embarrassing even, as if desire has an expiration date stamped quietly on it, somewhere around menopause, and anything past that is supposed to be graciously set aside in favor of grandchildren and gardening and growing old with dignified resignation. I want to push back on that as firmly as I know how. There is nothing undignified about wanting to be loved at any age. There is nothing frivolous about a woman in her 60s or 70s wanting someone to notice the particular way she laughs, or to bring her coffee before she asks for it, or to reach for her hand crossing a parking lot the way people do when the reaching has become instinct rather than performance. That desire is not a character flaw you've failed to outgrow. It is one of the most human things about you, and it did not retire when you did. And there's a third layer here too, one that shows up especially if you've raised children who have opinions about. This children who love you, but who sometimes, without meaning to, treat the idea of their mother wanting romantic love again as slightly strange, slightly disloyal to whatever came before, slightly embarrassing, in the way grown children sometimes find their parents' inner lives embarrassing in general. If you've felt that particular chill, a daughter's raised eyebrow, a son's uncomfortable silence when the subject came up even lightly at dinner, I want you to know that reaction says far more about their own discomfort with change than it does about the appropriateness of your longing. You are not required to shrink your heart to fit inside the version of you that's easiest for everyone else to hold. So here is where we actually are. Honestly, you are carrying real caution, earned by real experience. You are carrying a quiet, unspoken sense that this kind of wanting isn't allowed. And you may be carrying, on top of both of those, the discomfort of people who love you, not quite knowing what to do with this part of you. That's the honest weight of it. I'm not going to pretend that weight isn't real, because you'd feel the falseness of that instantly, and rightly so. But before I tell you what I actually believe is happening underneath all of that, something Jung himself wrote about with real seriousness, there's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it matters more than it first appears. Why does this particular longing tend to surface later, in the second half of life, rather than simply fading the way our culture assumes desire should? Hold on to that question. We're going to answer it properly. Carl Jung spent much of his later work studying what he called the second half of life, not as a slow decline from the vitality of youth, but as an entirely different psychological season with its own tasks, its own hungers, and its own capacity for depth that simply isn't available to us earlier on. In the first half of life, Jung observed, most of our energy goes toward building a career, a family, a home, an identity that other people can recognize and rely on. It's necessary work. But it also asks us to set aside enormous parts of ourselves in the process, parts that don't fit the role we're busy constructing. What Jung called individuation is the process of slowly, often painfully, reclaiming those set-aside parts in the second half of life, becoming finally the fuller and more particular person you actually are, rather than the useful, reliable, endlessly available version of yourself that the first half of life required. And here is the piece that I think so many women miss entirely: the capacity to love and to want love doesn't quietly retire during individuation. It often deepens because you are no longer loving from the anxious, self-erasing place so many of us loved from at 25 or 35, when so much of our sense of worth was still tangled up in being chosen. You are instead capable of loving from wholeness rather than from need. That is not a smaller kind of love. It is very often a larger one. This is also, I think, where the fear starts to make a different kind of sense, and where the flicker you've been feeling starts to look less like foolishness and more like evidence. Jung wrote about something called enantiodromia, the strange psychological law by which anything pushed to its extreme eventually reverses into its opposite. A grief carried long and honestly enough, rather than simply hardening into permanent numbness, will often at some unpredictable point begin to turn back toward its opposite, toward openness, toward a fresh appetite for connection that can feel almost disorienting in its intensity, precisely because it arrives after such a long, quiet season of its opposite. The ache you've been noticing lately isn't a betrayal of your grief, or of the love you already lived and lost. It's very often what that grief looks like on the other side of itself, once it's been carried honestly long enough. This is also, I think, why so many of these small moments have been arriving together lately, almost as if they were coordinated, even though logically you know they aren't. The song, the lingering glance at the pharmacy counter, the photograph that undid you differently than it used to. Jung had a name for that kind of clustering too: synchronicity, the experience of outwardly unrelated events lining up in a way that feels meaningfully connected, even though no ordinary cause links them. He didn't mean it as mysticism for its own sake. He meant it as evidence that the psyche often signals a shift that's already underway, in advance of the conscious mind fully catching up to it. When several small, unrelated moments all seem to be pointing in the same direction at once, that clustering is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as coincidence. It's often less a sign that something magical is about to happen to you, and more a sign that something real has already begun happening inside you. That's why this doesn't feel like the same hunger you might have felt at 20. It has this quiet, patient depth to it, this refusal to be rushed, because it's arriving in a woman who has already survived loss and knows, in her bones now, exactly what actually matters and what doesn't. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to know that everything I'm about to describe next was shaped with exactly that kind of woman in mind. Not someone starting from nothing, but someone starting from everything she's already survived. There's one more piece of this before we get to the signs themselves, and it matters, because I don't want you carrying anything into this conversation that isn't true. Jung also wrote about what he called projection, the way we sometimes place old, unrelated wounds onto a new person or a new possibility without quite realizing we're doing it. If your marriage ended in betrayal, it would be entirely natural for some part of you to look at any new possibility of love through that old lens, bracing for the same ending before the story has even properly begun. Recognizing that pattern doesn't mean the fear disappears instantly, but naming it honestly is often the very first step that allows the fear to loosen its grip even slightly, which, in my experience, is usually enough to let something new actually get through. There's a name for what happens when grief and hope stop feeling like opposites and start feeling like two parts of the same honest experience. Jung called it the transcendent function, the psyche's own quiet capacity to hold two seemingly contradictory truths at once: grief and desire, loss and longing. And out of that tension, produce something genuinely new, rather than forcing you to choose one feeling and suppress the other. You do not have to stop loving what you lost in order to make room for what might still come. You are not required to pick a side between honoring your history and wanting a future. The very fact that both feelings can sit in your chest at the same time tonight, without canceling each other out, is itself the beginning of something Jung would have called integration, a fuller, less divided version of you than the one who first walked through that loss. So let's talk now about the signs themselves, the ones I believe genuinely indicate that some part of you, whether you've admitted it out loud yet or not, is quietly readying itself for love again. The first sign is the one I already described, and it's simpler than people expect. You find yourself lingering over old photographs, old dresses, old versions of your own laugh, not with grief, but with curiosity. That curiosity is individuation quietly at work, reacquainting you with parts of yourself that got set aside for decades, parts that happen to be exactly the parts capable of loving and being loved freely. The second sign is that you've started noticing beauty again in small, unnecessary ways. The particular gold light on your street at 6 in the evening, the smell of coffee brewing somewhere nearby that isn't yours, a stranger's kindness that stays with you longer than it logically should. Noticing beauty without needing a reason to notice it is one of the clearest markers that grief has loosened its grip enough to let something else back in. The third sign, and this one surprises people, is that you've become slightly less patient with situations and people that drain you. A friendship that only ever takes, a family obligation that leaves you depleted every time you find yourself with less appetite for those than you used to have. That's not bitterness, that's your heart, quietly clearing space, the way you'd clear a cluttered room before inviting someone new into it. The fourth sign is that you've caught yourself imagining ordinary, undramatic future moments. Not a wedding, not some grand romantic gesture, but something as small as 2 cups on a counter in the morning, or someone to tell about your day who actually wants to hear the small, unremarkable parts of it. When your imagination reaches toward ordinary companionship rather than dramatic rescue, that's a very mature, very grounded kind of readiness, not a fantasy. The fifth sign is that you've forgiven yourself, at least partly, for whatever you believe went wrong in your last chapter of love, a marriage that ended, a husband you lost, a version of yourself you wish had known better sooner. Self-forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in small increments. And if you've noticed even a little more gentleness toward your own past self lately, that gentleness is doing real work underneath the surface. The sixth sign is harder to describe, but I suspect you'll know it the moment I say it. You've started to feel a specific physical restlessness in your own body, a wanting to be touched, to be held, to be seen, that isn't shameful and isn't foolish, whatever anyone your children's age might quietly think about it. The body keeps its own honest record long after the mind has talked itself into pretending certain hungers don't apply anymore. The seventh sign is that you've begun, quietly, to take a little more care with yourself, not for anyone else's benefit, but because some part of you is starting to matter to you again, in a way it hadn't for a while. A new lipstick you didn't need, a walk you took for no reason except that the evening looked inviting. That kind of self-attention is rarely vanity. It's usually the earliest evidence of a woman remembering she is, in fact, still someone worth attending to. And the eighth sign, the one I think matters most of all, is this. You've stopped needing love to prove anything. You're not looking for someone to fix a loneliness you can't survive without them, or to complete a story you feel is otherwise unfinished. You are, instead, a whole woman who happens to have room in her life for someone else, which is precisely the condition Jung believed made love in the second half of life so much steadier, so much less desperate, and so much more likely to actually last than anything most of us experienced when we were young. If even one of those 8 signs found you tonight, I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's foolish. I think it's evidence, quiet and accumulating, that something in you that you assumed had finished is in fact only just beginning its next real chapter. Before we close tonight, I want to tell you something about my own life. I haven't said out loud in quite this way before. There was a season, a good while after I lost my husband, when I felt something like this myself. A small, unexpected warmth toward a kindness someone showed me. Nothing dramatic, barely worth mentioning at the time, and I remember the immediate, almost automatic guilt that followed it, as though noticing warmth from anyone else was some kind of quiet betrayal of what I'd already lived. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the guilt wasn't loyalty. It was fear wearing loyalty's clothes, and once I understood that, the warmth didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt, very slowly, like permission. I share that with you not because your story needs to look like mine, but because I think so many of us carry that exact confusion between loyalty and fear. And it helps, sometimes, to hear someone say plainly that the two are not the same thing. If no one has told you that plainly before tonight, I wanted to be the one to say it, by this fire, exactly the way I'd want someone to have said it to me back then. You might be telling yourself that recognizing these signs is one thing, but actually doing anything about them is another matter entirely, that it's easier, safer to simply notice and then quietly go on as before. I understand the pull of that, but noticing and doing nothing rarely stays neutral for long. It tends to either curdle slowly into a familiar kind of numbness, or it tends to grow gently into exactly the kind of readiness we've been talking about tonight. I would rather you choose the second one, on purpose, while you still have all this warmth in your chest from sitting here with me. Something is already shifting for you, right now, tonight, whether you've said so out loud to a single other person yet or not. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need a plan or a timeline or an answer for the family members who might raise an eyebrow. You simply need to let yourself notice what's already stirring without immediately talking yourself out of it the way you might have done 6 months ago. I want you to picture something with me for a moment, gently, without attaching it to any particular person or promise. Picture yourself a little further down this road, not rushed, not desperate, simply a little more open than you are tonight. Picture the weight in your chest feeling slightly lighter, the way a held breath feels when you finally let it go. Picture yourself laughing at something small and genuinely meaning it, the sound of it a little more familiar to your own ears than it's been in a while. Picture a hand near yours, maybe reaching, maybe not yet, but the possibility of it no longer feeling like something to brace against. Picture the ordinary evening quiet of your own home, feeling less like an absence and more like a pause, a held breath before something rather than an ending in itself. Picture yourself telling a small, unremarkable story about your day to someone who leans in rather than glances at their phone, and picture how strange and how welcome that ordinary attention feels after having gone so long without it. None of this is a guarantee about who or when or how. It's simply what a heart tends to feel like on the other side of finally letting itself hope again. And I believe quietly that you are closer to that feeling than you think. Here is what I want you to actually do. Starting tonight. Not a grand gesture. Something small and entirely within your reach. Tonight, or tomorrow morning at the latest, I want you to do one ordinary thing, purely for the pleasure of being seen. Wear the color you've been avoiding. Or take the walk at the hour the light looks best. Or simply let yourself linger a moment longer in front of a mirror without the automatic urge to look away. Not for anyone else. For the quiet, private experiment of letting yourself matter to yourself again, on purpose, today. If this is your story too, I would love to know which of the 8 signs found you tonight, the one you recognized before I'd even finished describing it. And if you're watching this tonight with your tea or your coffee close by, tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment every night, and I mean that. You are so far from the only woman feeling this exact stirring tonight. Tell me I'm not alone in believing love doesn't have a closing date. And let's remind each other of that, together, in the comments below. If tonight's conversation shifted even one small thing in how you think about what's still possible for you, I would genuinely love to know what it was. And if this found you at exactly the right moment tonight, just comment the word ready, and I'll know. Come back and sit with me again tomorrow night. There is more I want to share with you. And I mean that every single time I say it. You are not behind wherever you think you're supposed to be by now. You are not too late for a love you thought had already finished its chapter. You are exactly where you need to be, sitting right here by this fire tonight, and I am so glad you let yourself feel this instead of quietly talking yourself out of it one more time.